The hairs on the back of your neck stand rigid as you slowly become aware of a pair of eyes fixed intently upon your every move. Your body stiffens against them, but the gaze is too strong. It's not human. It knows no bounds, and it watches your every move. How will your life change when you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the eyes will never leave you, that the feeling of being watched will never falter, that it will be there like a bruise on your back for all time? Welcome to episode 9 of Not Now, Not Here. In this week's episode, a pair of travelers encounter a new fixture in the sky. Charlie and James are camping together when they learn that they are being watched. It is not a usual gaze. There are no binoculars or telescopes, no cameras or zooming lenses, but merely a pair of encompassing black orbs on the eastern horizon, and a face like a second moon. What will it mean for them, and what will it mean for the mountains loved by so many travelers? How can anyone begin to cope with the penetrating sight of Noom? So turn down the lights, close your windows and doors, and sit back. Prepare to enter a world that is not now, not here. Noom. The two of them went camping, Charlie and James, out in the mountains late one spring. They were peaceful mountains, calming and cold, and an easy place for travelers to lose themselves in the namelessness of nature. Charlie and James went there every year. They shared a tent and spent their afternoons hiking and fishing in the cold, roaring river. One morning, James woke up early and left the tent to make coffee. Restarting the fire was difficult because the wood was covered with dew. James, looking up in frustration, became aware of a giant moon-sized face staring down at him from the eastern horizon.
"Charlie!"
James hollered.
"Charlie, come here, quick!"
"What?" Charlie rubbed sleep from his eyes as he came out of the tent.
"Look at that."
James pointed.
"Jesus,"
Charlie said.
"Big feller."
He was big, James thought. His body was utterly black, as if he was wearing a sheet made of night standing dark against the morning sky. His face was pale white and as round as the moon. His eyes and mouth were dark holes, like an all-seeing Halloween mask. Charlie and James could see the head and shoulders of the big fellow peeking over the mountains.
"Well, where do you suppose he came from?"
Charlie asked. James bent down to finish lighting the fire.
"Well, the city, probably." "Is he looking at us?"
James shrugged.
"Not much else to look at."
He could have been looking at the mountains, or the trees, or the rivers, or even the animals. But James had a feeling the big fellow was looking at them, the two of them. You could feel the weight of his eyes, like two deep black oceans, pressing against your back.
"Yeah, hurry up with the coffee,"
Charlie said.
"Hurry yourself."
Their morning passed much the same as other mornings, though it was hard to ignore the big face looking at them. James made the coffee, and Charlie cooked the eggs. After breakfast, they hiked up the southern face of a nearby mountain, nearly reaching the snow line in hopes of getting a better view of the river and the valley. Charlie kept a brisk pace, with James following a few yards behind. In the middle of the morning, there came a sudden, roaring bellow from the east. The sound shook the trees and caused birds to take flight.
Lord,
James said.
what was that? An airplane? I don't think so,
Charlie said. They hiked out of the woods and stood with their feet on the rocks above the tree line, looking to the east and the big fellow. He hadn't moved, but both James and Charlie supposed he had made the sound.
What'd he say? Moon?
Charlie asked.
I think it was Noom, like moon backwards. Well, why'd he say that? That ain't a word. Well, I haven't the faintest,
James said. In the cold air of the mountain, both James and Charlie wondered why anybody said anything. Back at camp, they had ham and cheese sandwiches for lunch and split what was left of the now cold coffee. Neither of them had shaved in more than a week, and they rubbed at their new beards while regarding the big fellow.
Do you want to go home?
James asked. Charlie thought about it.
I suppose it wouldn't be the worst idea. Big feller like that showing up can't mean anything good. But for Pete's sake, Jim, we got another 3 days out here fishing, and I'm in no hurry to go back to work.
James agreed. Neither of them liked the big fellow, but they both enjoyed camping too much to quit it so easily. So they went fishing. James was a fly fisherman and spent most of the afternoon downstream where the river was wider, hip deep in the water, his mind on his line and his flies. Charlie, a bait fisherman, set several lines and waited. He had just settled down for a nap beside the river in the afternoon sun when, again, came a booming voice. Charlie jumped up in fright and scowled at the big fellow the way you might scowl at your alarm clock. It could have been his imagination, but he thought he saw the big mouth move ever so slightly, grinning. Charlie pulled in his lines and went to find James. They met each other between their two fishing spots.
He's scaring away all the fish,
James said. Disgusted, they made their way back to the camp. They had a quiet dinner, and as the sun set, James said,
Suppose we should try talking to him?
Charlie swallowed his beans and said,
Think we can? We're awful small, and he's awful far away. We could get up to the top of that mountain,
James said.
Our voices would carry a good ways from up there.
They decided to give it a try in the morning. They both slept uneasily, and James woke up at dawn to make the coffee.
Charlie,
James hollered.
Charlie, come here. He's closer.
Charlie came out of the tent, rubbing his eyes.
Well, I'll be,
he said. The big fellow's face was closer now. His black hands were resting on the peaks of two nearby mountains, and it looked as if he was pulling himself forward to get a better look at them. Of course, each of the big fellow's movements was too large, too grand to be seen with the naked eye. James supposed it had taken all night for him to move his hands up to those peaks and pull himself closer. The big fellow said, as if to confirm James' suspicions. The bellow was much louder this time, as if each musician in a million-piece orchestra struck his lowest note in unison. The sound knocked the tent down.
I suppose we better get going then,
Charlie said. They didn't even eat breakfast. They just put on their heavy coats, packed water and jerky enough for a day trip, and began their climb. It took most of the afternoon to get to the peak of the mountain James had suggested. The climb itself wasn't anything difficult. They'd climbed to the same summit 2 years prior and knew the way.
In fact, it would have been an enjoyable climb had it not been for the looming face of the big fellow. James wondered what on earth someone that size could be thinking. Was he enjoying watching their camping trip? Was he angry with them? Was he confused? Passing judgment? There was no way of knowing what ponderous thoughts rolled around in his mountain-sized brain. James tried to stop thinking about it. The peak was not the highest in the surrounding mountains, but it was covered with snow and allowed Charlie and James a view of the curve of the earth. The air was clean and crisp, and the wind blew flakes of snow into their beards. They looked at the big fellow. He was closer now.
"Well, what?"
Charlie asked.
"Do we just start shouting?"
"I suppose," James said. So that's what they did. James went first.
"Hey!"
he shouted.
"Hey, big feller! What are you looking at?"
His voice was pushed and lifted by the wind. The two men could almost see his words blow away like a piece of paper, carried straight to the big fellow's face. No answer came. The big fellow didn't move.
"Go away!"
Charlie yelled.
"Quit your looking at us!"
James and Charlie looked at each other. Then the wind changed direction and blew toward the two men from the big fellow.
"Who are you who address me?"
The voice of the big fellow was no longer a menacing blast that shook the ground. It was instead a whisper, the sound of one snowflake brushing against another.
"I'm James, and this is my partner, Charlie. We're over here, on top of the mountain."
James waved his arms. The wind blew again.
"Ah, yes, I see you there. The tiny pair who went up the mountain and into the river yesterday. What do you want?"
James looked at Charlie. Charlie said,
"We want you to stop looking at us and quit making such a racket."
"But, my tiny friends, I am not looking at you.
the big fellow said.
I am looking at the mountains in their entirety. I see each leaf on each tree, each bug on each leaf. I see each snowflake in each drift, each fish in each river. It's my nature to watch these things, my friends. It is what I do, and what I have always done."
"Could you stop?"
James asked.
"It's awfully unsettling, you see. We're on vacation."
"I'm afraid not,"
the big fellow said.
"You may not understand it, but it is necessary that I see these mountains and everything in them. Thus, my gaze will fall on you as well. You should feel honored to be seen by one such as me. I am here as a friend to the mountains."
"Could you at least stop making such a racket?"
Charlie yelled.
"You're scaring all the animals, and you knocked our tent down."
I must again decline. The sound you hear is my own name, spoken in the language of the mountains. I am introducing myself to them, you see, in a language they have spoken since time immemorial. It sounds much larger than your own language, and I can understand why this is unsettling to you. But I assure you, it is vitally important that I communicate with them. The mountain's face a perilous danger.
What sort of danger?
A danger to their essence. A danger that threatens the very heart of these mountains. It is a threat that could come from any source and at any time. To protect them, I must watch them. To save them, I must speak with them.
Well, how about talking a little softer?
James yelled.
I'm afraid not.
The big fellow said.
Shoot,
Charlie whispered.
he won't listen to a thing we say. Well, how likely is it you'd listen to an ant if an ant started hollering at you?
James whispered back.
Pretty likely if I was there first,
Charlie said.
It's not as if I go around shouting at anthills. And if I was shouting at anthills and the ants came out and asked me to quit it, I'd quit it. Yeah,
James said. He turned back to the big fellow.
We were here first,
he said. The wind struck them.
But I will be here last.
The big fellow said. His face was unmoving. Cursing, Charlie and James made their way back down the mountain. They knew there was nothing they could say that would make any difference. It was night before they arrived back at their campsite, and they were each so hungry and cold that they started a fire immediately and cooked a big meal. The face of the big fellow watched them chop the carrots and peel the potatoes. It watched them stir the stew and bring it to a simmer. It watched them eat. It watched them wash their dishes in the stream and set their tent back up. Like a moon with a pair of all-seeing eyes, the big fellow hung there all night. He never blinked. He just looked and looked. In the morning, a closer, louder knocked their tent down and woke them up.
Shoot,
Charlie said.
Let's get out of here.
Charlie and James packed up all their gear and loaded everything onto their backs. They hiked down out of the mountains the way they'd come, and the big fellow watched their every move. By noon, they reached their truck, which they'd left parked in a field near the highway. They threw their packs in the back, started the old motor, and headed back to town. It wasn't a long drive, but it took them away from the big fellow, and each of them felt relieved when his face finally disappeared behind the mountains.
I suppose we'll just have to try again next year,
James said.
Sure,
said Charlie.
Next year.
But next spring, Charlie and James heard from friends and fellow fishermen that the big fellow was still there in the mountains, still watching.
Maybe next year we can go back,
they said. But next year, again they heard the big fellow was still there. He didn't leave the following year, or the year after that. To this day, if you go to those mountains, you can see him there. You can feel his safe and omnipotent gaze as he watches every tree, every rock, and every stream. But nobody goes to those mountains anymore. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. We hope you found it as startling to hear as we found it to make. Be sure to tune in next time for another creepy installment. This week's episode features music by Kevin MacLeod. The songs Healing and On the Shore are used under the Creative Commons license and can be found at incompetech.com. You can also visit notnowNotHere.com for more information about the music, including legal information and links to all the songs you've just heard. Other music was provided by jewelbeat.com. Both of these sites are great if you need music for any projects you are working on. The mountainous atmosphere you heard on this week's episode was created using www.ambientmixer.com. Other ambient sound came from Freesound.org. For a list of all the sounds used and information about the Creative Commons license, please visit notnownothere.com. This podcast is written and performed by Phillip Kohtz. If you like any of the stories you hear on the show, you can read them or download them for free online. You can find all of the stories published in a variety of digital formats, corresponding artwork, poetry, our blog, and also news about future releases at notnownothere.com. You can also find us on Twitter and probably other places. If you like what we're doing, please spread the word and be sure to stop by our site and give us your feedback. We'd love to hear your thoughts, opinions, criticisms, and ideas. It's time to return to the now and the here. Have a happy new year, and may the wind be ever at your back.